Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar presentation today, where we're going to provide you with an update on the October Visa Bulletin, processing times, and a variety of related topics. My name is Ron Hoppe. I'm the CEO of Worldwide HealthStaff Solutions, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you from wherever you may be joining us from around the world. Today's webinar presentation is unique in a number of ways. Firstly, we will be joined today by healthcare providers and candidates from around the world. We're also being joined by a significant number of U.S. healthcare employers who obviously have a great interest in this topic as well. And I'm joined by a couple of co-presenters this morning that I'm very excited about, and I'll introduce them properly here in just a moment. As you can see in the chat portion of your screen, for me it's in the upper right-hand corner. There's a yellow box there. We call this our sticky note or our post-it note. And just to remind everyone that has joined us today, and everyone that has in fact registered for this event, that recording of this video presentation will be sent out to everyone within the next 24 hours. So please be watching for that. Please feel free to review this presentation. Please feel free to share it. Share that link with any friends or colleagues that you think would benefit from this information as well. Many of you are already letting us know in the chat section of the screen where you're joining us from. I would ask that you just take a moment, and if you haven't already done so in the chat box, just say hello. Let us know where you're joining from. We always are very interested to see all the different countries that are represented when we do one of these types of presentations. Also, the chat feature is going to be used today to field your questions, and towards the end of our presentation, or at the end of the formal portion of our presentation today, we will certainly make sure that we have some time set aside to respond to some of the questions I'm sure that we will be receiving. So please feel free to type those into the chat box, and we'll do our very best to answer questions at the conclusion of our presentation today. It's my pleasure, and I'm very excited to be joined today by two colleagues. I consider them both to be good friends, experts in the field of healthcare immigration law. Chris Musillo, who has practiced for probably as many years as Worldwide HealthStaff has been engaged in international recruiting, maybe even a year or two longer. Chris has managed not to have any gray hairs, unlike myself. And Mike Hammond, who's probably the senior member of our team here, but always great to have Mike join us. And Mike as well has extensively practiced healthcare immigration law for 25 plus years. And both Chris and Mike bring a unique perspective. Both are very heavily engaged in ongoing advocacy efforts and in contributing to proposed regulatory and legislative changes. Both work very, very closely with the U.S. State Department, and as I said, they bring a unique perspective to this issue based on many, many years of firsthand experience. So, Chris, welcome. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Ron.
Always appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules and joining us for these presentations. So, Chris, we'll start with you, and if you could just sort of start us off this morning. The long-awaited October 2023 Visa Bulletin is out. And if you could maybe just give us an overview of maybe just the visa bulletin itself, what it is, and what purpose it serves, and just an overview of what the October bulletin is telling us.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks, Ron, for having me join again. It's always good to get out and talk to both you and then to all the thousands of people who are watching this video. So with respect to the Visa Bulletin is a publication that the State Department, the U.S. State Department, issues monthly, and it instructs the embassies and consulates or locally, domestically here in the United States, the local USCIS offices, whether or not and at what timeline those offices are allowed to process the final interviews for folks who are in the green card process. And so it's probably best to explain it by virtue of looking at the Visa Bulletin itself. And so the Visa Bulletin itself for October, which is the Visa Bulletin that starts here in about 4 days. It shows for all countries except for India and China, a retrogression date of December 1st, 2021. We'll talk about China and India in a minute, but for now I'm going to focus on all countries, including Mexico and China. And so the EB3 date again is December 1st, 21. And what that means is if you are a nurse or physical therapist, your I-140 has to have been filed before December 1st, 2021. If you're most other occupations, you file first what's called a PERM or a labor certification. That labor certification is approved, and then you file your I-140. And so that might be for medical technologists or nurse aides or occupational therapists, these kinds of jobs. For those folks who are required to file that PERM first, the priority date listed on the Visa Bulletin, we look to the date of your labor certification, not the date of your I-140 filing. And so what this practically means for nurses in particular who are from all countries other than India and the Philippines is that unless their I-140 was filed before December of 2021, they unfortunately will have to wait until that final action Visa Bulletin date moves past their personal priority date, which is again the date that either their PERM or their I-140 was filed.
Okay, very good, Chris. Thanks for that explanation. Mike, having had a week or 10 days now to reflect on the October 2023 Visa Bulletin, we'll get into this in detail maybe later, but just your initial impression of what this Visa Bulletin is telling us in terms of what we're likely to see happen here in the next couple of months.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. First of all, there were really no surprises. So I think that was nice. We saw forward movement of 17, 18 months for both rest of the world EB3 and Philippines EB3, which is what dominates the RN space. We also have what I would call almost a return to normalcy. So if you're looking at processing times over the last 2 to 3 years, they were significantly impacted by COVID. And the reason why COVID impacted is that the number of immigrant visas or green cards available in the employment-based category have what they call a spillover provision that's been around since the 70s, but had never been used, which means that all the family-based immigrant visas not used in any given fiscal year were kind of dumped over into the employment-based category. And so with the U.S. consulates closed down due to COVID, we had most family-based immigrant visas are issued from overseas. They were shut down. People were not coming in, et cetera. So we had huge influx of new visa numbers, extra immigrant visa numbers. And that created a situation where RNs could be filed under premium, come into the U.S. in 8, 9, 10 months, 7 months, those time frames. And we enjoyed that for several years, the last 2.5, 3 years. That's now gone because we no longer have the spillover, which means That was our aberration. That wasn't the norm. If you lived through that, that was your norm, but it wasn't the norm for the industry. The norm for the industry was more like where we are again today, which looks like we're going to settle in at about the 18-month to 24-month mark. So I think to some degree, I look at this bulletin and I go, we're back to where we were, business as usual. We had this nice gift for 2.5 years that was wonderful for all of us. Now we're back to where we were. So I think in a lot of respects, it was a positive bulletin. I did not view it as a negative bulletin.
Yeah, very good. Mike, interesting comments. Chris, maybe you could just follow up. Mike commented that, with the priority date for most candidates being December 2021, that we're kind of back to normal. This is kind of back, if we just count back to December 21, I think that's 18 or 19 months, right? But even before recent visa bulletins, processing times have been in that kind of 12 to 18 month range in any case. Can you maybe just briefly comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, certainly everything Mike said, I would entirely agree with, which is that to some degree, we've been living in an artificially current world for the last 2 or 3 years while we've been dealing with the retrogression because of the phenomenon that Mike said. I can say this, though, in my mind, a 18, 20, even 24-month retrogression, while looking at it through the lens of where the visa bulletin has been over the COVID period, it's obviously frustrating and disappointing, and we all, of course, wish it were quicker. When looking at it through historic lenses and the realities of the time that the process just simply takes, whether it's getting the I-140 approved or getting the National Visa Center process done or getting the embassy itself, I think that 18 to 24 month processing time is actually, not too troubling. And as long as it stays in that range, I think we're going to be fine. The reality, of course, is, Ron, the demand for internationally trained nurses has just skyrocketed here in the United States. And so I don't think anything like a 1.5 to 2 year retrogression is anything to be too concerned about.
All right. Very good. This is not the first time, Mike and Chris, we've had these conversations, right, over the years. This phenomenon that we call retrogression has occurred from time to time in the past. Mike, maybe just a comment on, really the last time prior to this that we saw significant retrogression for any period of time. And again, maybe just a quick comment on how you think this, the current circumstance is likely to be different from the last big retrogression for the benefit of anyone that's here that might have lived through that at that time.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few differences between, what we saw in, not 09, 10, et cetera, when the retrogression was very large. And a few kind of just thoughts as to why I think it's different. First of all, is, as Chris just alluded to, the demand for international RNs and international workers, even in other non-healthcare occupations, has simply skyrocketed and continues to hold really strong in growth as opposed to a tailing off. So that's a huge difference. In 2009, 2010, we were faced with much more uncertain economic times, and so the demand was actually significantly slowed. We saw a lot of abandoned RNs, even though their priority dates may have been current during that time frame. We're seeing none of that whatsoever. In fact, we're seeing the opposite. The demand is super strong. I think one of the other things that I think we're seeing is that this retrogression is not as bad from a date perspective, but it is more widespread, which means that historically we've had retrogression that the Indian IT community has faced, Chinese, mainly engineers and scientists, et cetera, have faced, and then RNs. And that's it. It's been very limited in scope. Now we're seeing retrogression in some of the EB1 executive level categories. We're seeing retrogression, the rest of the world in some of the higher EB2 categories, the OTs, some of the higher level engineers, etc. We're seeing it from countries that had not seen it before. So all of a sudden, it's affecting more people and more companies. And when retrogression is affecting more people and more companies, when the German manufacturing company and the Japanese automakers care about retrogression, then all of a sudden we get an opportunity for greater relief than if the only people caring about retrogression are the hospitals, staffing companies, and the IT companies. So I think the broader need and the broader effect is going to have fairly large repercussions in a positive way for us to get some resolution. So those would just be the highlights I would hit off of how I think this one is different.
All right. Very good, Mike. Thanks. That's some great insights. We're going to pivot just a little bit in our conversation. As I mentioned at the outset, we're joined by both many applicants from countries around the world, as well as U.S. employers. And next, Chris, if I could ask you to maybe just address those applicants or candidates that are joining us and just share with them, an overview of what they should be doing right now to put themselves in the best position to arrive in the U.S. in the shortest possible time.
Yeah, so Ron, I think this is in some ways one of the more important parts of the entire session we're doing today, and that's because I think it speaks to sort of the fundamental nature of U.S. immigration, which is that it is at times frustrating. It is very bumpy, which is that sometimes things appear to move very fast, other times they appear to move very slowly, and those timelines can switch, somewhat quickly and without much notice. And I can certainly appreciate, having done this for about 25 years, that has got to be extremely frustrating. Having said that, Ron, I think it's important for people in the U.S. immigration process to recognize, broadly speaking, that there's two things. There's things that you can control, and there's things that you cannot control. And the thing that none of us control, me, Mike, yourself, Ron, any of the listeners on today's webinar, we cannot control the U.S. government processing times, whether they are being delayed for legalistic reasons, like the 18 to 24-month retrogression we currently have, or whether they're being delayed for bureaucratic reasons, which is just maybe a particular embassy is stacked up. And so even though one might expect an interview to happen in a month, it takes 3 or 4 months. We can't control any of that. None of us can. And we want to keep an eye on those things, and we want to manage our lives and our professional and personal lives accordingly. But we want to recognize that we can't control those. On the other hand, there's a whole slew of things that we can control. So number one is, again, and we talked a little about this earlier, the U.S. demand for really all workers, like Mike said, but in particular for purposes of this call, healthcare workers such as nurses and nurse aides and med techs and physical and occupational therapists. The thing that you can control is you can get your education completed, which I'd imagine most people on this call certainly have. You can make sure that your education is comparable to the U.S. educational system, which hopefully most people on this call have. You can take your licensing exam. So if you're a nurse, you can take your NCLEX exam. You can register with a good recruiter and employer. And I'll give a plug here for Worldwide HealthStaff. I have known Ron and his team for many, many years, and I can say that they are in the very top tier of recruiters into the United States. So you can do all that. You can take your English examination and begin working or even completing your visa screen. So you can do all of those things. And I would encourage you to do all of those things, because not doing those things, whether the I-140 retrogression date is 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, will not really matter if you do not get all of those things going. And so the big thing is to control what you can control. One of the things that I'm constantly surprised, even after all this time doing this kind of work, is actually how the time moves, which is, if we were doing a call like this towards the end of 2021, even if there had been a 2-year retrogression, that might have seemed like a long time, but that was not even 2 Christmases ago. It was not very long ago. And I'm constantly surprised, even with a year or two retrogression, how quickly you will move through the process. But you cannot do that if you're not meeting all of those things that I mentioned a little earlier.
Very good. Very good, Chris. Appreciate those comments. I think just a couple of sort of practical things that I would just add to your comments, at this time, specifically related to applicants and wondering what their next step might be under the circumstances. We get inquiries, again, just recently from applicants saying, well, can I switch my employer? Can I switch my agency? And, somehow, can you make this go faster? The answer is don't do that, right? The answer is there is no employer or no agency that has a secret formula or that, somehow is able to make this process go more quickly than what's been discussed here. If anybody is making those types of representations, you should probably be very, very concerned. And just to reinforce what Chris said, regardless of the processing times, taking the required exams is a requirement. And those exams aren't going to get any easier. They aren't going to get any cheaper. And getting those done now is going to put you in the best possible position going forward as the priority dates advance. For nurses, obviously, getting visa screen is very important. Delaying that probably is ultimately going to delay your process overall. And as always, the importance of clinical experience, current clinical experience, probably is something that we could do a whole separate presentation on. I know we, in fact, have in the past. So these are some additional things that I would just add as well to Chris's comments. Mike, let's pivot over now and talk to our U.S. employers that have joined us on the call today. And kind of same question, but focused from an employer's perspective, given where we're at, given what's going on in the healthcare workforce, your thoughts and your advice to employers in terms of what they should be doing now.
Sure. Let me bounce back for 1 second to the comments about employees. And I think I'd echo everything Chris and Ron said. But one thing in particular that you want to keep in mind is, since it's very common for people to take, from the Philippines in particular, to take overseas assignments, you want to be very, very careful during this time of retrogression to work with your agency, work with your hospital to make sure that you are not taking assignments that are going to last too long, that's going to impact your ability to come in the U.S. So whether you're looking to renew or take a new assignment, make sure you communicate that in. So, okay, employers, a couple things. First of all, the essence of what Chris and Ron just said about employees, which is to continue to move forward, is exactly the same is true of employers. Is you want to continue to move forward. You want to make sure that you always have a PWD in place, that you always have a posting in place. If you're a union hospital, those can take about 100 years to do. So make sure all those things are done and up to date, et cetera. And then I think that there's an opportunity for you to make sure that you are staying connected to candidates during this period of time. Make sure that there is something that you're doing so they understand that, hey, this timeline has changed, but it's not changed that long, and we're still excited about you coming here. There's still going to be a job. There's still going to be opportunities, et cetera. A couple other practical things. Depending upon your circumstances, you may want to consider H-1Bs. If you are a cap-exempt employer, and by that I mean a nonprofit affiliated with a university, and you have certain units in your hospital where you want a BSN or more experienced nurses to fill, typically specialty units, CCUs, ICUs, et cetera, then you want to consider an H-1B. An H-1B is not the answer for everyone. Matter of fact, it's not the answer for even the majority of people, but it is certainly the answer for a certain number of hospitals and positions. And so if you think that's you, reach out to your agency, reach out to your attorney. Both Chris and I do a lot of H-1Bs for RNs, and the change in the attitude from the approval rate on those is significantly different than if we'd been having this talk, say, 2 years ago. So that's the second thing. The third thing to kind of look at is you may want to consider whether or not premium processing still makes sense. Right now, premium processing, for a lot of people who don't know, it is you pay an additional fee to the government, $2,500 filing fee, and they'll process your I-140 in 3 weeks. Okay. What that doesn't do is it doesn't change your priority date. Premium processing does not make you get your green card any faster. It does not make it so that you get your interview any faster. It simply means that you get your I-140 approved faster. So in a period of time where we're going to take 18 to 24 months before we're having an interview, whether I have my I-140 in my hand in 3 weeks or whether I have it in 6 months is pretty irrelevant. Okay? So, and I'm not saying for everyone that's the right answer, but I do think for some hospitals, that may be something that's worth considering is, do I continue premium or don't I continue premium? Keeping in mind that if there were massive changes in the visa bulletin, you could always take an I-140 that's filed under regular and upgrade it to premium in about a week's time or less. So it's not that you are destined to stay down that regular path if things were to change. So those would be my highlights there, Ron. Ron, we lost you.
Thanks, Mike. I'm back. Thanks for particularly calling out H-1B, and we'll just talk about that for just a little bit more here in a sec. Chris, can you maybe just follow up on Mike's comments about premium processing? And in the current environment, what just real quick, what the pros and cons or the advantages of using premium processing or not using premium processing might be?
So happy to do that. So I mean, I think that the main thing to think about when we're thinking about premium processing is that it's really just a question of dollars and cents. There's virtually no reason not to use premium processing if money is not a factor. Now, of course, money is almost always a factor, and so then we need to layer the thought process a little bit. The way we like to think about it is, if the I-140 has been is prepared and ready to be filed, and the priority date is maybe within about a year or so, then in my opinion, premium processing should almost always be used. And the reason is because that priority date can vary with some degree. And so we always want to be able to have our case move through the process as quickly as possible. But when I'm thinking about anything beyond about a year, to me, it comes down to a few things. One, how much is peace of mind worth? So, the I-140 processing times can vary without premium processing. We see them sometimes take as quickly as only just a month or so, oddly enough, which is not much longer than the premium processing program. Other times they linger out there for 7, 8, 9 months. And the publicly posted USCIS processing times for I-140s, we find those to be, kind of fake news, right? The dates listed by the USCIS are usually those themselves are out of date. So they'll say, for instance, the processing time is taking 7 to 9 months, but if you look closely, you'll see that number hasn't been updated in 6 months. And so what they're really telling you is what the I-140 processing time was maybe in February or March, which is of no value here at the end of September. The other thing to keep in mind is that an I-140 that's filed regular processing can always be upgraded. And so if peace of mind is not that important to you or the nurse or the employer, depending on who's making that decision, then you can file regular processing. And let's just, hypothetically, you file your case regular processing now, September 27th. 2 months go by and maybe the priority dates leap forward and you say, okay, now I would like my case to be premium processing. It's fairly quickly for the law firms like Mike's firm or our firm to be able to put together a premium processing upgrade petition. We can do it in just a day or two. We overnight courier that document to the service center. And within a few more days, we will get confirmation that the case has been upgraded. And then within 15 days, we'll get the approval notice. So again, just thinking about it, if it's a short processing, if it's a short priority date from when you're filing your I-140, I think by and large, premium processing is a good idea. If it's a longer processing time, then the question is, how important is the peace of mind of knowing the case has been approved versus the uncertainty of having the case just lingering out there? Now, to be sure, for most of our clients, and I suspect the same is true for most of Mike's clients, we get the vast majority of these I-140s approved. I don't know what the numbers are, but they've got to be, in the 95, 99% range, I suspect. So denial is usually not much of a concern. Having said that, when you are the nurse, you only have one case. You don't really care about the statistics. You only care about your case. But keep in mind, your case can be filed regular processing and can still be upgraded, very quickly into the more favorable processing time. So those are some of the things that I think both hospitals, health systems, and the beneficiaries, the employees themselves, will want to think about when they're considering premium processing.
Right. No, thanks, Chris. Just want to circle back to Mike calling out the H-1B visa option. We're not going to dig very deeply into that here today. That's a topic for an upcoming webinar that we'll be offering soon. But just again, if you're a U.S. healthcare employer and your organization is not-for-profit, certainly feel free to reach out to your HealthStaff account manager or to reach out to myself, and we'd be happy to further that conversation with you. Just before we kind of look at some predictions for down the road, just want to take a couple of quick moments and just share a couple of snapshots for the benefit of everyone that's on the call today in terms of some things that we see going on in the U.S. RN workforce today. As the year has unfolded and as we look back over the last 10 or 15 years, we see that international RNs are representing an ever larger portion of the total U.S. RN workforce. That number is now just past 16%. So when we consider 16% of a very large workforce, it's very, very clear just how important international nurses are to the delivery of health services in the U.S. A couple of interesting things with regards to nursing school enrollment and NCLEX pass rates. In 2022 was the first time in many years that there was actually a decline in BSN nursing school enrollment. It was not an overly large decline, but a decline nevertheless, and broke a trend of significant enrollment increases over a number of years. So that's something that we're certainly going to keep a close eye on. And then also when it comes to the pass rates, the domestic pass rates on the NCLEX exam has gone down up until the end of 2022. We can see that in 2020, 78% of U.S. graduates were passing the exam on the first attempt. And in 2022, that number had declined all the way to 69%. Now, in 2023, they've introduced a new version of the NCLEX exam, and we've seen the pass rates come back in a very positive way for both domestic candidates. Pass rates are back up to sort of that 2020 level. And for international candidates, we've seen the pass rates go up by almost 30% for those individuals taking the exam for the first time. So just a few things there. When we talk about nursing school enrollment and graduates, the current graduation rate is flat. the numbers around 180,000. And the only reason we even make this point is to simply, call out the fact that while great effort has gone into increasing the number of graduates in the U.S., that effort seems to have plateaued. While the increase in demand has not, the demand continues to increase, while the domestic supply seems to have plateaued, notwithstanding retirements and practitioners leaving the profession for other occupations, which is also a real factor. And we're really encouraged to see that the number of international RNs passing the NCLEX exam is up very, very dramatically in the past several years. And in fact, in 2023, I think the number of NCLEX passers is tracking to be at an almost all-time record high. So we're excited to see that the international candidate pool is extremely robust, and that the number of candidates available have rebounded dramatically since the time of the pandemic, when access to these tests was really, really limited. Chris, I know we touched on this a little bit, but just I think want to just circle back and touch on this again. Sort of, what do we see? What do we expect to see happening here in the foreseeable future and kind of over the course of this year, based on what the October Visa Bulletin is telling us? Understanding that the Visa Bulletin is updated and changes month to month.
Yeah, so predictions are hard, Ron. In particular, predictions about the future are particularly hard, right? But but let's give it a shot. So when we're trying to think about this, one thing that I look at, and it goes a little bit underreported, is if you look on the Visa Bulletin, we have a table A, which is the final action dates, and that's really what we've been talking about throughout this call today. There is a table B, which is called the dates of filing chart. And if you go down there, you'll see that it looks identical in structure to the table A chart, except the dates are all different and they're frankly more favorable. And so what is the table B chart? Well, the table B chart is the State Department telling its officers through what date they should continue processing cases. Now, what does that mean? Well, for those of you who are familiar with the process, we have an I-140 stage, which is at the USCIS, and then we have a National Visa Center stage. And at the end of the National Visa Center, we have the interview at the embassy or consulate themselves. Those are for consular process cases, over cases where the interview is going to take place overseas. Of course, our other path is the adjustment of status, Ron, which is cases the I-140 is filed domestically here in the United States. But then because the interview is going to take place in the United States, we go through a slightly different path called the adjustment of status. And that just simply means that the interview will take place in New York or San Francisco or Miami or Cincinnati or wherever the nurse or worker is located. So those are the only two differences between there. So the table B chart tells the agencies to keep going through either the adjustment of status process or the national visas process. So the government continues to do things like background checks, continues to get everything set up other than setting that final interview, because the final interview, of course, is determined by Chart A, the chart that we're all familiar with. Now, here's why that's important. The table B for all other countries is February of 2023. Again, we'll set aside China and India. And then for the Philippines, it's January of 23. So almost the same date, virtually the same date. And so what that is, the Department of State signaling, and I say signaling purposefully because it's not guaranteed, but it's the State Department signaling that in the foreseeable future, they, the State Department, believe that the table A date, the more important date, will move into January, February of 2023 in the near future. Now, what the near future is up for the Department of State to decide. They don't really define that. But it's an indication that the State Department officers should continue to do background checks and other types of checks, but not set the interviews for essentially anyone who has a priority date throughout 2022. And so that can, I think, give some optimism to anyone who has a 2022 priority date that sometime in the near future, those cases will prove to be current on Chart A. Now, there's been a lot of qualifiers in the last few statements I've made. And the reason is, to be fair to the State Department can look up and see how many applications there are with various priority dates. That part they can do. What they don't know is a few things. One, they don't know how many people who have those priority dates will continue through with their case. As many of you may know, life changes. People may move to other parts of the world. They may decide to stay in their home country. All of those things are unknowable. And the State Department doesn't know how quickly those cases will move. So there will be some fall off in numbers, and they don't know whether that will be one case or thousands of cases that will fall off for that reason, number one. Number two, there's some duplicate filings. Sometimes an employer decides not to pursue a case and a new employer picks up the case. But from the State Department's perspective, that actually looks like two cases when in reality it's one case. Well, unfortunately, the way the system's built, it's difficult for the State Department to identify whether or not there's one cases or multiple cases. There's a third factor that might influence the speed with which the cases move through the pipeline, and that's the number of dependents. Sometimes we get, for instance, a nurse who is a single person, unmarried, and they move through the process, and then they only use one visa, whereas other times we'll see a husband and wife and maybe a few children, 2 or 3 children, and so that might use 4 or 5 visas. And so for all of those variables, which again are all sort of unknowable, we don't know how quickly they're going to move through, but the State Department is taking its best guess to say, by the publication of Chart B, that in the near term, they expect all cases through 2022 to actually have their interviews set up. I don't think that's going to be November, Ron, but I think it could be into early 2024 that we could see all of those 2022 priority dates become current. Again, contingent upon all of those factors that I mentioned a little earlier.
Ron, we lost you again.
Thanks, Chris. I think that's certainly very, very encouraging insights, and hopefully for everyone that's on our call today, encouraging to everyone that has joined us as well. So thanks for sharing that. Mike, anything to add in terms of predictions about the Visa Bulletin or anything in world events generally?
World events generally, that's a pretty wide topic for me. But no, I think one of the things that is important to note is the Visa Bulletin also often contains a kind of prediction, usually short term, and it's usually found on the last page of the Visa Bulletin. I know most of us, as soon as it comes out, we simply look at the charts and we find our own date, and that's natural. But if you read further in the back, there's often a prediction. So, for example, this year, or the October Bulletin that just came out, talked about specifically the expectation of data advancements, and then they used the terminology of within quarterly limits. So I think a lot of us are kind of looking at that language and saying that maybe we're going to expect that the next bulletin looks exactly like this bulletin or very similar, and that maybe we're not going to see an adjustment until the first quarter. Of course, we're guessing. So there's a whole lot of speculation built in. One of the things to keep in mind is that the use of immigrant visas, the allotment that Chris talked about, whether it's all spread out through the course of the year or whether it's all used up in the first quarter or whatever, the more efficient we use all of those and don't have waste, the better off for the overall system. So when we talk about dates retrogressing in the summer, and we're talking about, Chris mentioned that maybe in early 2024, we're going to have a lot of this movement, that would mean that the system is working efficiently and using up the immigrant visas. And so further retrogression in the summer is usually fairly irrelevant. So I would agree. I think it's tough to predict, but I do think that we are expecting some further forward movement.
Very good. Chris, just one last thing before we get into Q&A. I know you're very involved in a variety of advocacy efforts, regulatory, legislative, etc. Just a real quick comment on your assessment of what's happening on that front and what efforts are underway.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, I do go to Washington, D.C. with some frequency. I was actually just there this time last week. Many of you may be aware that last term, which ended December 31st, 2022, there was a bill that had been introduced called the HWRA, the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. That bill received an enormous amount of support, although, of course, it did not ultimately become law. We had about 25% of the U.S. Senate, which is the upper house, that signed on to the law in advance, which is the way the U.S. Senate indicates that anyone who signs up in advance, or what we call co-sponsoring, generally means that they are saying, unless something changes, they will vote in favor of the bill. And so getting 25% of the Senate on a new bill was very encouraging, especially because the mix was 14 Democrats and 12 Republicans, which is bipartisan. And if for any of you who follow U.S. politics, getting 14 Democrats and 12 Republicans to agree on what color the White House is normally exceptional. So we were happy about that. Likewise, in the lower chamber, which is called the U.S. House of Representatives, we had about 60 or 70 co-sponsors out of a body of a few hundred. And so that was also favorable and bipartisan. So for all of those reasons, we were very happy. This year, the HWRA has not yet been introduced, but I'm optimistic that a 2023 version of the HWRA will be introduced shortly. Behind the scenes, people have been working exceptionally hard to get a bill crafted, to try and get some preliminary co-sponsors who are ready to really, upon the launch of that bill, come out and say that they will be right away co-sponsoring the bill. I expect all that to happen in the near term. Two more points, Ron. First, what the bill essentially did last year and likely will do with the newest version of the bill is set aside nurses and physicians, actually, for a special class of visas for a few years, somewhere between 2 and 4 years. Some of those things are still just being finalized as we're on the call here. So that would be very favorable. That's very similar to what the HWRA did last year. So that's one important thing. The other important thing is the U.S. government's fiscal year ends here in a few days, October 1st. So it ends on Monday. It's extremely likely, and this isn't any inside information, you'll see this in the popular press. It's likely, not guaranteed, but very likely that the U.S. government reaches an impasse in terms of budgeting on September 30th. What that would mean is if the U.S. Senate and House cannot both agree on a budget for October 1st, the U.S. government will shut down. It will essentially not have any money. Now, it's not an entire shutdown. Certain segments of the U.S. government will continue, essential services, the military. Frankly, a lot of embassies and posts overseas will remain open in some limited capacity. A variety of these things will remain open, but a lot of other things will not remain open. Some of that we know, some of that we don't exactly know which agencies, or at least which parts of which agencies will or will not be shut down. One thing, though, that seems likely is if the U.S. government does shut down on October 1st, it will be more or less impossible for a bill like the HWRA to be introduced. So that's the bad news. The good news is the longest shutdown in the recent past has been under a month. And so, optimistically, we hope that even if there is a shutdown next week, that it doesn't last more than a couple of weeks. And so in the long run, it won't really mean too much in terms of an HWRA being produced. So again, just in sum, I suspect we will get an HWRA introduced shortly. I suspect that bill will mean a 2 to 4 year pause on retrogression for nurses, which will mean essentially everyone will remain current. But there's no guarantee that the bill will get signed into law. There's still a lot of hard work that will need to be done in the forthcoming months. And the last point, although there will likely be a U.S. government shutdown next week, and that may slow the process for a few weeks, it ultimately will probably not mean anything negative for the ultimate likelihood or unlikelihood of the bill getting passed. Ron, you're on mute again there. No, you're still on mute, it looks like. You popped on for a nanosecond.
Sorry about that. Just having some technical issues here.
Sure.
Chris, thanks for those insights. And I know a lot of work has gone into this, and we'll continue to work with you and Mike and our clients' government relations teams to continue to advocate on behalf of visas for healthcare providers for certain. We've had many questions come in, and I know that Tracy and CJ have, from our side, have been kind of monitoring those. We've got some time remaining to our scheduled time today. So Tracy, I'm going to turn it over to you to take us through a couple of questions, and over to you.
Glad to. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Chris. Let's jump right into the Q&A. So I think one of the top questions is, I know we have a lot of healthcare professionals watching, whether it's an RN, whether it's a nurse aide, medical laboratory technologist, whatnot. And this is a question for the panel. I guess I'll let whoever wants to address it. What is the biggest difference when looking at the U.S. Visa Bulletin for an RN versus a nurse aide? Which table and category should one be looking at?
I can take that one. I know that one. I want to take the one I know, and then you might get the next one. I might not know that one. So some nurse aide cases will fall under the other worker category. Some nurse aide cases may fall under the third preference category, so they may be the same. But nurse aide cases have to go through a PERM or a labor certification before they file an I-140. And it's that time when it is determined whether they're going to fall under the EB3 other worker category or under the regular EB3 skilled or professional category, likely skilled. So there can be a difference between what you're looking at, but you will know that at the time your PERM, your labor cert is filed.
Thank you. An OPT question. Do you have opportunities for RN graduates in the United States with OPT work authorization for adjustment of status?
Chris, maybe you can comment on that question.
Yeah, so if you are in the United States and you have been a student, you are likely on a visa called an F1 visa, which ordinarily allows you a 1-year postgraduate, what we call an optional practical training, OPT, is the question, as Tracy said. And what that means is for 1 year after you graduate, you're able to stay in the United States legally and work. In some instances, that will also allow us to file a green card for you and may allow you to continually stay in the United States. And so what you will want to do is, number one, you'll want to connect with the Worldwide HealthStaff team and Ron and his team to see if they have an employer who they can match you with, number one. And then number two, you will want to make sure that you or your employer really have your case explored with an experienced immigration attorney to assess timelines and the ability or perhaps inability for your case to be filed for the green card while you're here in the United States. In some instances, we may be able to file the green card, but you'll still at some point have to leave the United States and return home. It's a very specific calculation that the attorney would go through. So you'll want to get some expert advice on your particular case for your timeline.
Okay. Thank you. And here's a good question. It's a specific question, but I think anyone following could probably put their own priority date into this kind of question because it's a priority date that is after the posted. The question is, my priority date is March 2022. When will I likely migrate?
Well, I think
answer that one. Okay.
Yeah, I think March 2022. We're now at December 1st, 2021 on the final action date or the chart A. Chart B is beyond that. And so the expectation is that at some point this fiscal year, likely in the earlier part of the fiscal year rather than the later part of the fiscal year, that priority date of March 2022 will become current, and then you will be able to immigrate. That's at least my speculation into the great beyond.
Okay, thank you. A question asking for good news on the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. Chris, you were talking about that. I think we pretty much covered that.
I think we covered most of that. So if the questioner wants to, after the tape's over, maybe rewind, I don't know, about 10 or 15 minutes back, I did a deep dive into where we are with that. That
was a good one. Next, let's use this one right here. Do you have opportunities for RN graduates in the U.S. With OPT? That's very similar to the previous question. Okay, let's go with this one. Relocating to the United Kingdom. Thoughts on that?
Yeah,
bring an umbrella.
Bring an umbrella. Yeah, I'll jump in on that. And I think there was a good comment on this earlier. You know, the nursing workforce has become very, very mobile around the world. It really has become a global workforce. And we find many of our candidates pursue employment opportunities in other countries than where they're currently situated when they're initially recruited, in an effort to improve themselves from a clinical experience perspective, improve their financial situation, perhaps their social situation. I think that, and that's certainly a fine and good thing. Again, the main consideration here is to carefully consider whatever the commitment period might be to the employer in the UK or elsewhere, and how that lines up with the status of your U.S. immigration application. You don't want to find yourself in the middle of a 2 or 3 year commitment in the UK or elsewhere at the time that your U.S. Embassy interview comes available. So that's something that your assigned case manager, if you're an existing candidate, can certainly help you process. And for new candidates, certainly our recruitment team would be happy to give you specific feedback. But I think that's sort of the general approach we would take here.
Okay, good.
Okay, so let's do one more question, and then we'll wrap up so we keep to the promised schedule today.
Yes. And as a reminder to all, we also have a live recruiter chat link there in the sticky note at the top. So if we did not address your question or you're not able to catch it earlier in today's webinar because you're going to get the replay, you do have live chat capabilities with our team as well. But let's jump into this because it's kind of going back to the visa predictions that you were talking about. Hello from Palestine. Is it possible the next visa bulletin in November will move forward?
Sure, it's possible. It's definitely possible. Will it happen? We'll find out actually in just about 2 or 3 weeks here. But, this brings back to sort of an overarching theme of this. I think you want to plan and keep a good eye on these things, but you can't control it. So I wouldn't spend, nights worrying too much about it. My guess is if you've got a priority date in 2022, at some point in the near future, you will become current. We had someone here who said March of 2022. I think Mike took that question, and I'd agree. My guess is that case will become current pretty quickly. So,
all right, very good. Mike, Chris, thank you both again for sharing your experience and your expertise. I think very, very beneficial for everyone that joined us live in person today. And for the others that will receive a recording of this presentation, we had almost 4,000 people register for this event, which just tells us, again, just confirms for us just how important this topic is. So thanks, Chris. Thanks, Mike. Thank you to everyone that joined us today. We greatly appreciate our relationship with you. We want to continue to be able to answer all questions in a timely way and to provide the most current and the most accurate information in the most transparent way possible. We look forward to our continued relationship with everybody that has joined us today. Please keep an eye out for upcoming webinar presentations that we have scheduled on a weekly basis. Thank you all. Chris, Mike, thanks. We look forward to being in touch with each and every one of you soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.